Hey yo, welcome to episode 7 of Beyond Asanas with Jason and
Paul?
today I wanted to inquire about more of the 8 limbs. I'm doing yoga instructor training and you've been teaching us in terms of the yoga philosophy. For those that are unfamiliar, how would you describe what they are and why they maybe even exist?
I love the topic. The 8 limbs are super important, I think. And not only if you're a yoga geek like I am, but also if you want to be a good person and you are taking yoga seriously, how do you incorporate these 8 limbs into your good personness? But before we dive in, man, you said something that was, I think, interesting. You said you're taking a teacher training course. I want everyone to realize how big of an undertaking that actually is, man. You're like halfway through of a 9-week process, and you want to share anything else about it? I think it's huge that you're doing this and maintaining your job and buying a house. I mean, you're doing so many things right now. How do you feel?
Yeah, it is. It is a bit overwhelming. It reminds me a lot of medical school in terms of just the intensity of amount of information and time dedicated. That's where I think that being a practitioner or partaking in classes of yoga and then actually learning the art of teaching, completely different experiences. And with that being said, like every day is 10 hours and where it's just relentless in terms of participation and engagement. But the thing that I think is a little different from medical school is that it's an opportunity where I look at it. I mean, don't get me wrong, medical school was an opportunity, but there's a lot of things that felt like it was a checklist. But this feels more of where everything is so intentional and has this opportunity to deepen my understanding of not only myself, but yoga. And the crazy thing about it is, and I think that's what's calling me to talk about the 8 limbs more, is that it's not even as much about the physical practice as it is about learning more about myself.
Bingo, man. Give me some of that. That's
Yeah.
exactly. With that being said, you're practicing them already at a high level because you said you recognize the opportunity. Now, a lot of people might say, I'm busy. There's too much going on. I'm not going to do this training now. I'm not going to participate in this now. I'm going to wait till the time is better. But most of us probably know, and we've experienced it, that perfect time never comes. But you took the opportunity at a time when it was probably not the easiest to take the opportunity, right? You're deep into your job. You are in the process of doing this new house thing, which is absolutely incredible. And you're diving into this training. So I commend you, man. You approach things from a yogic perspective without even having known about the 8 limbs. And I love that. Really.
Yeah. And to your point, I think that the idea of there's no perfect time to really take on a lot of these extracurriculars, but I think we've talked about this before, but it's the counterintuitive idea of that it takes energy actually to create more energy, just like exercise, where it's like, oh, I don't feel like I don't have the energy to exercise, but when I actually do, it creates more energy.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Even what this is, where where when we have these opportunities to connect and gratefully through Charles's great setup that it creates this energy. And in doing so, it's similar to coffee where I feel this engagement. I mean, coffee doesn't actually make me feel engaged. Coffee just gets me all wired up. But this is a sense of aliveness that I've been feeling with the yoga instructor training and doing these types of activities that I feel is different from being awake versus being alive and engaged.
Yeah. You're so on it and you're so in it, man. I love that you're saying this. We talked a little bit about the 3 modalities of awakened doing, and I promise we'll get back to the 8 limbs in a second, but you are experiencing what I experience when you've said, even on this podcast several times, that you recognize that I have a lot going on in life. I'm busier than I should be. I pile too much on my plate. And yet whenever I engage myself in an opportunity that involves yoga teaching, yoga events, yoga practices, community, the energy is almost like magically there. And I've come to believe and understand what that actually is. So I'm going to just say what I believe that is. Enthusiasm means in God. And when you're operating and God is not, in this context, it's not a man in the clouds. I'll just summarize it as the entire cosmos is God. Let's just say that. Everything in the universe is God. Let's just say it. When you're operating with that, you're in sync with the universe, and the universe is in sync with you, and you have help. The phrase, the stars align, comes from that. The phrase, doors open, comes from that. And from a yogic perspective, when you're taking these opportunities that empower you to live your dharma, that's when that happens. When you're doing things, when you recognize either consciously or subconsciously that this opportunity is going to honor your purpose in some way, your grand purpose, you're going to have help. You're going to be able to succeed even if you're tired, even if it seems like not the right time, you're going to have help. And I believe that's what this is.
What is that structure of realizing those connecting dots? Is that all from yoga philosophy, or is that like Eckhart Tolle, or is that
Both. And I know you wanted to ask
can
me.
go anywhere.
Yeah, of course. You were going to ask me how I viewed yoga philosophy before I found the actual 8 limbs themselves. And now how has my view on things changed after I knew about the specific 8 limbs. That concept of the 3 modalities of awakened doing, it's Eckhart Tolle, but I've said this many times and I believe it wholeheartedly that he is like a modern day Patanjali. He is. And he doesn't claim to be. I view him that way. He's taking the non-physical concepts of yoga, which is so everything that's not downward dog, warrior pose, everything about yoga that's not done on the mat, that you said the training is actually more about. Eckhart Tolle takes that and gives us a super clear, tangible way to practice that in today's environment, not 200 BC's environment when Patanjali lived. And again, it's not the yoga mat, physical muscles, balancing, flexibility in the hamstrings. It's none of that. It's all the other stuff, which is 90% of yoga. The 10% of yoga that's on the mat, I'm going to say that's relatively simple. The stuff that is not the 90%, that's inner, beyond asanas, is what Eckhart Tolle is presenting. So the 3 modalities is the 8 limbs stated in a different way.
Yeah, that's when you were going over the 8 limbs during the philosophy portion of our training, I was thinking about how this is just a roadmap, but there's so many different ways to actually integrate these aspects in modern life.
Yes.
Where even the physical practice, where it doesn't have to necessarily be yoga. Like you can really get centered in Pilates, but
True.
Or get centered in marathon running. And all of these are just means in terms of optimizing the physical body so that it can sit and do a lot of the inner work aspects of one of them being, what was it, like removal of the senses kind of thing?
Yes, exactly. That's the 5th one. Pratyahara is being able to not be ruled by what our eyes see and what our ears hear and what our skin feels. Being able to control that.
But yeah, like if I'm in physical pain or just constantly out of touch with my body, it's going to be very hard to reach that
Exactly.
aspect.
Exactly. That's why the asana portion is there. Being in touch with your body somatically, as the pop word goes. Yes, we need to be in touch with it and acknowledge that and then understand it and work with it so then we can go beyond it.
Yeah, kind of circling back to what the 8 limbs are in general for those that may not
Yes, of
be
course.
familiar with it.
Yeah.
Can you describe about like maybe when it even came into existence? Is this what yoga, what came first, like the actual practice of yoga,
Sure.
or is it this?
This is a practice. It's just not on your mat with hamstring flexibility and muscles and stuff, but it's a life practice. It's when you wake up and go out to your job and you have a situation to handle. That's a practice. But yes, so what are the 8 limbs? And also, I want to be specific and tie in, since we already talked about this idea of in God enthusiasm, which is right from Eckhart Tolle. I said that's a modern day Patanjali teaching in a way. And what I specifically meant by that, let's be specific. So when you're operating with Dharma, with your purpose, and you're like a cell in the greater organism of the planet, and the planet is like maybe an organ in the body of the solar system, and then the solar system is like one entity in the galaxy, and the galaxies have chains, and then anyway, we're a part of that. So that concept is stated in the 8 limbs when it relates to the last 3 limbs. Dharana, dhyana, and samadhi, the last 3, which are learning to focus the mind, learning to keep extended focus, and then samadhi, which eventually our consciousness transcends our brain, and we merge, which is the meaning of yoga, the unionizing of our lower self, our body, to our soul, and then the unionizing, because yoga means union, of our soul to the all soul. That's the universe. That's the God I was mentioning. And Eckhart Tolle says, when you live on earth with purpose and do things that are altruistic and honor your purpose, the universe helps. That's the same thing. That's the specific connection between Eckhart Tolle and the 8 limbs that I wanted to share. But now let's do the 8. Should we talk about the 8?
Please.
Okay, cool. And sometimes it seems as though the 8 are sequential. Like you said, a roadmap. We should look at them all cumulatively. Like you can work on transcending and work on being kind. because being kind, being nice is part of the yamas, the moral guidelines, which is the first one. But samadhi is number 8, the last one. So you can work on that when you're meditating, and you can work on not being a punk in traffic and swerving in front of somebody if they're going too slow, like I've done many times. Again, so it's not work on number 1 and then master that after 15 years of working on it, then work on asanas, for example. So number 1 and 2 are yamas and niyamas, and they're 5 each. Yamas and niyamas are moral ethics and guidelines, and we can dive into each of those. And I brought something, since I love being scholarly in an amateur sense, I brought a list of the Noble Eightfold Path from Buddhism and the Four Noble Truths from Buddhism and the Quran's guidelines and the Torah's and the Ten Commandments. I brought all those so we can just kind of compare and contrast how the yamas and niyamas relate to the Ten Commandments in Christianity, for example. Limbs 1 and 2 of the 8 are moral and ethical guidelines and kind of just general rules that are, for many of us, kindergarten level, be a good person type rules. Then 3 is the one that gets all the press and the one that everybody thinks about when you think of yoga, and you guys all know what that is. Asana. It's the physical things, physical postures. Every warrior 2, every chaturanga, every up dog, every grab your big toe and drape your leg casually behind the head. Asana is number 3, the physical body. Then we have pranayama, which is number 4. And Patanjali specifically separates asanas from pranayama. In other teachings, like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika, which is the text on physical yoga, the body and the breath are more intertwined and combined. 1 is yama, 2 is niyama, 3 is asana, 4 is pranayama, which is breath control and energy control. If you believe in prana, that's that. And then 5 is what you mentioned earlier about the senses. 5 is what we consider to be the gateway between all of the physical active practices that we've said, numbers 1 through 4. And then number 5 links those to the last 3, which I also said were more about connecting to your higher self and God, really. So pratyahara refers to controlling the senses. We've got 5 physical senses and then however many other super physical senses that we have access to. Not being annoyed as much by things that we perceive in the external world, or not being attracted so much. The quintessential idea of attachment, which we talk about a lot, vairagya, the Buddha says attachment leads to suffering. That relates to being attracted to things, attached to things, but it equally relates to being repulsed by things. Because if you really dislike something, and some people hate things, I try not to ever hate anything. That strong dislike is every bit a connection to that thing as wanting that thing. Think about that. Because if you have no relationship to that thing, that's best because it's not in your consciousness. But if you really dislike something, there's a connection there and you're still attached to it. Even though you don't want it, you think you don't want it, but you're connected. That's this idea of being able to control the senses, not being controlled by the external world or by memories or anxieties. All right, that's 1 through 5, and then 6, 7, 8. 6, dharana, which relates to being able to focus the mind. Harder than most people think to keep your mind still for 10 seconds even. And we do that in many ways. There are many ways to learn focus. Usually it's closing the eyes and sitting still and thinking about something, one thing. And when the mind wanders, bring your mind back to the one thing that you're focusing on. That's meditation. Then the next limb, number 7, is dhyana, which is called different things in different texts. So if you pick up a book on the Yoga Sutras, you remember how I was saying there are thousands of different books on them because many authors will translate them and commentate on them in their own way. Some authors and teachers will translate limb 7 to meditation because that means it's extended concentration. If dharana is learning to get your mind focused on one thing, keeping it there for an extended time, a minute, 2 minutes, without moving your mind, which is extremely advanced in my opinion. That's dhyana, which some teachers call meditation. I like to call it contemplation instead of meditation. I reserve the word meditation for true samadhi when you're transcending. I call it contemplation because at the point of extended focus, when you can get your mind on one object, whether it's a problem you're trying to solve or a loved one or your breath, you start to receive insight. That's where the magic starts to happen. If the mind can stay still for a couple of minutes without thinking of anything else, the comfort of the chair, your thirst, your to-do list, something happens. Something starts to shift in your consciousness at that point. And I call that contemplation. You receive answers, insights somehow.
Downloads.
Exactly, downloads. Maybe from your higher self, or maybe from the thing you're thinking about, or maybe from the cosmic mind. Who knows where it's from? And then number 8, samadhi, I think, should be broken into 2 separate limbs. There should be 9 limbs, I feel like, because there's a distinct lower samadhi and a distinct higher samadhi. The lower part of samadhi, every teacher says this about lower samadhi. I've never seen a discrepancy. That lower samadhi is when you've focused the mind on your object of meditation. You got to be still for this, like sitting or lying down in a meditative state, of course. You begin to merge with it, and you begin to feel a non-separateness. And I know that's kind of a pop culture thing in spiritual circles. We're all connected. We're all one. Well, your body's there and mine's here, so clearly we're not connected in the physical. But in lower samadhi, our consciousness is transcending the physical, and we're entering into these other realms where space, dimensional space, is not what it is in the physical. And you merge with the object of meditation. That's lower samadhi. Higher samadhi is sometimes referred to as nirbija, without seed or without thought. That's when that's complete transcendence, when the object of meditation and your body and yourself drops away and there's just cosmic consciousness. That's why I think samadhi should be 2 different things.
When you think about this as a whole, do you find yourself getting excited or anxious about that idea of trying to put so much together in one lifetime?
I get excited. We talked about this at the last podcast, that I feel lucky that I've found a way to not feel anxious about getting it all done in this lifetime. We said this here last time about Dharma, that if you do truly believe that reincarnation is real, it takes the pressure off of doing everything. It takes the pressure off of YOLO.
So even kind of, if I were to get even more curious, is like, how do you think they even decided to differentiate between focus and meditation? Why even separate the 2?
Focus is a prerequisite. You got to learn, or concentration. Concentration or focus is a prerequisite to true meditation. Practicing focus is what most humans need to do. Practice focusing. Because everything in society conditions us not to focus. Everything in society conditions us not to focus, except for if you're in a yoga studio and or except if you're in a Zen ashram where everything is designed to be sattvic, calm, and spiritual. But if you're not in a specific environment like that, we're being screwed, basically. Think about billboards. I noticed this just the other day. I'm driving on 215 south somewhere, and I realized that there aren't very many static billboards anymore. Almost every billboard is digital. Why? So you can get more images to your face as you're driving by. That's the opposite of focus. That's the opposite of meditation. Why do you think reels are only 90 seconds? Or remember, stories used to be only 15 seconds. That's the opposite of meditation. The opposite. They're screwing us.
And as we're talking about this, like where I can be focused in our conversation, which is still different from meditation, like being so engaged with the connection that I'm having with another individual is a different practice than meditation itself.
In some ways, yes. I like to call us, like we who are doing spiritual work, but we're also out engaging in life, I like to call us spiritual warriors, because we're out doing the work in the world. We don't need to differentiate, really. I mean, yes, I believe that you and I and everyone in your training and everyone in our yoga community, I believe that we all need to have our own quiet, private, personal meditation practice daily, where you sit or lie down and you do actual meditation. However, spiritual warriors, we need to be out talking to people. We need to be out sharing our thoughts in Charles's amazing podcast studio. We're doing a meditation right now. We're not going to transcend into higher samadhi because our eyes are open and we're physically oriented. I got to make sure I'm not talking too loud. I got to make sure I drink water so my throat doesn't sound weird. Like, you're in the world. We can't leave by doing this. But we're also intending to make that connection with each other and with our listeners. And our mind is certainly not wandering about our to-do list too much. We are relatively calm. We are focused. Like, that's we're doing it. We're doing everything but transcending right now.
Even kind of circling and taking like a helicopter view of this practice, it's not a religion. I want to clarify that, right?
Yes, of
It almost
course.
sounds like a religion.
Yeah. What are the differences? This is another great conversation to have. I feel like we do need to sometimes clarify that we're not asking anyone to leave a religion or to adopt, to sign up and tithe and give us 30% of your income. We're not. We're definitely not asking for any of that. It's not. You can view the eight limbs as doctrine. You can, but there's never anything in the Yoga Sutras teaching. I've gone through it many times, the whole teaching. There's never any warnings about you're going to go to hell if you don't do these things. You don't have to believe any doctrine to be a yogi. In order to be a yogi, it's literally just practicing calming the mind. Patanjali comes that right out of the gate in the second sutra. He says, yoga is calming the mind. That's what it is. If you practice that, you're a yogi. You don't have to practice brahmacharya, which is no sex, or rather controlling of your prana. You don't have to, never tell a white lie in your entire life. You don't have to do those. You're not going to go to hell. So that's the main difference. In most religions, you have to believe certain things, and you have to do certain things, like take communion and believe that Jesus died on the cross for you, and this and that. There are rules. Those requirements don't exist here. And if we have said that kind of lightly, that they're not requirements, so I can walk that word back and say they are suggestions to reduce suffering in your life. And if you want the peace and knowledge and cosmic knowledge that comes from samadhi, this is how to get there. But you don't have to. Fine, don't do it. Who cares? Right?
Yeah. They're almost like ancient recipes that have existed where this is how our ancestors created a recipe to find peace and stillness and ease, which is fascinating because I feel that more than ever are the practices of focus and meditation, almost to your point that you're mentioning with the road signs, needed to balance out what it is to live in modern day society where there's so much distraction.
There is so much distraction.
Which leads to so much dysregulation. Even from a medical standpoint, that's where I pondered about this when I was driving here, which is that when I think about the eight limbs, it's very much an approach to preventative healthcare, preventative wellness. So it's this idea that a lot of Western medicine, in terms of the way I was trained, is very focused on endpoints and symptoms when things manifest. But this is a way for someone to learn, even when they're not sick, to how to stay well.
That's true. I hadn't thought about that. You're absolutely right. The suggestions that are offered in the yamas and niyamas, the 5 of each, which kind of correlate more or less to the 10 commandments of Christianity, that people might not readily see how and why they can help the physical body become healthy. But when you consider the fact that your lifestyle can create stress and stress can create disease, there you go, right?
Yeah.
That's the answer. If you can eliminate a lot of stress and anxiety, or at least manage it better, you're going to get sick less, right? That's how to do it.
Like one of them is like basically saying moderation, right? That's the one about no sex. Like
Exactly.
Which is basically essentially most modern day diseases are a byproduct of well, my bread and butter is diabetes, high blood pressure, and high cholesterol and obesity, which are all byproducts of not moderation. So,
Interesting.
So that's where when I was overviewing this, I was thinking, I was like, man, even though as much as we say it's common sense, it's the idea of common sense is hard to actually implement. There's the idea of what we lack now isn't knowledge. It's actually how to implement and make actionable habits out of the knowledge.
Very good point. That's why I like Eckhart Tolle so much, because his book called A New Earth is the practical part of the Yoga Sutras, dude. That's it, man. And I want to implore our listeners that the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is kind of dry, and many students ignore it because it's not as fun or sexy as other texts like the Hatha Yoga Pradipika tells you how to do Nauli Kriya and move your belly around and create prana. And that's great, but we also need to learn how to eliminate some suffering in our lives. And that's where Eckhart Tolle helps bring the yamas and niyamas alive. Don't think it's going to be rosy and peaches and cream, man. That's the harder stuff. I said this earlier in our podcast today. Getting on your yoga mat and learning a handstand in the middle of the room with no walls is easier than mastering the stuff we're talking about. But the rewards are far greater. Can you imagine never getting sick? Can you imagine never having stress and anxiety? Now, it's not realistic to never in this life, for me at least, but that's what the Yoga Sutras teaches, man. That's like, when I realized that, my mind, like,
Wait, can you say that again about?
the Yoga Sutras teaches you how to be healthy in mind, body, and soul. Mastering your yoga practice on the mat is good for physical health, but physical health is a small fraction of your entire life. And when I realized that the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali gives you the recipe for living a suffer-free life, holy crap. But it's not easy. No one really wants to go and do that work.
And I almost want to clarify what you mean by suffering is because from my understanding, and if you can correct me if I'm wrong, which is that it's not that suffering doesn't exist. It's just that the attachment to the suffering or my perception of what suffering may be may not be as painful or
well,
may
I
not...
think it goes in stages. I mean, that happens first, but if you get so good at it, at not being attached to whatever is causing the suffering and letting suffering come and go, wouldn't it stand to reason that at some point you wouldn't suffer? The things would happen still. The car crash would happen still. God forbid the death would happen still. But if you practice this enough, wouldn't at some point you be able to experience and move through it without suffering? Doesn't that stand to me? That stands to reason. At some point, we might get there.
Yeah, and I mean, I think it's almost, and it's not to minimize someone's experience with those types of suffering.
No,
It's
of course
almost
not.
where the conditioning of the mind, right? Where the conditioning of how what a child perceives as suffering in terms of not getting something they want versus me, ideally, as I go through life and have more experiences of failures and setbacks and tragedies and grief, that those experiences in terms of pain and attachment lessen.
Yes.
Which essentially is, from my understanding, what you're kind of mentioning is like kind
Yes.
of almost where the knob gets turned down of suffering, but even though the same experience can happen.
Yes, that's a good analogy. I like that. The knob, and the way Rod Stryker teaches vairagya or non-attachment, it's really cool because he teaches it in stages, almost like a graduated switch. Like your knob has 3 settings, and 0 vairagya, which means non-attachment, which would like we'd be the Buddha all day long, which is unrealistic for most of us. That would be vairagya, non-attached. But then there are different stages. Most of us can't do it 100%. We're gonna when the tough situation appears in life, there's going to be either a little suffering or a lot of suffering. The dial and our practice on that dial is what determines how much suffering we're going to have. And let's read the 5 yamas and niyamas, and we can talk about how that can help reduce our suffering. We are not trying to become robotic. We're humans, and emotions exist clearly, and they don't have to run our consciousness. We can live in a way that emotions are not the ruler of our beings.
And just from a practical standpoint, like how are you thinking about in your day to day when you wake up, or you're like, oh, I got to hit number 7 today? Or is it just ingrained in your autopilot now that you're like, I'm just constantly moving towards all 8?
Sometimes yes. Sometimes I know I need more focus. Focus would be number 6, dharana, and that's when this morning I went outside and did some meditation out in the sun, and I realized, okay, this is beautiful. The second I closed my eyes and sat, I hadn't meditated for a few days. There was a big event Tuesday night, and there was an election, and so I realized immediately, oh wow, I was lacking in that. Sometimes it's a conscious thing I know about. Sometimes it's intuitive. My life, I've been lucky in this life that I found a lot of these things without knowing what I was finding. I was doing a lot of them without knowing what I was doing. But then when I found the text and when I started going dedicatedly down this path, I'm like, holy shit, that's what that means. That's what I've been doing. Now I can see how it's a little more concrete or concretized. And I can teach this now because now I have some language to put on what I've already been doing at a certain level naturally.
Yeah, so it's like creating more structure and a
Yes.
blueprint for you to
And that's
take that inventory.
And that's what Patanjali did when he compiled them. You've asked several times, did he write them or compile them? And they've been around way longer. The teachings themselves, calm the mind, focus the breath, smooth, like those teachings are way older than Patanjali. So 200 BC is when he had the insight to put them together in 196 orderly sentences, and they were orally taught. but he didn't make them up. So he had a teacher who probably taught him, and then he's like, I'm going to put these together in these 4 chapters. And so he didn't make them up either. He was probably already doing them somehow, and then he realized, oh, wow, there's information here. Let me see if I can teach this better.
So what you got there, Paul?
All right. This book is the second chapter of the Yoga Sutras. Usually the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali is one book, and you'll have all 4 chapters. Pandit Rajmani Tiganaya decided to be so thorough with his translation, and commentary that he has one book for each chapter. I brought 2 of them. This is the first chapter, Samadhi Pada, and then Sadhana Pada chapter, the chapter on practice. And so the 8 limbs that we're talking about today are presented to us halfway through the second chapter of the sutras in Sutra 228. So we go through all 56 in the first chapter. He doesn't mention the 8 limbs. Then we go through 28 sutras in the second chapter. And when we come to Sutra 28, he says, the practice of the limbs of yoga, okay, destroys impurities. Thereafter, knowledge continues to brighten all the way to Viveka Khyati, which is the domain of unshakable discernment. The domain of unshakable discernment. In other words, that's your higher wisdom, like not your brain. I mean, your brain is used to create words to speak, but this kind of wisdom is not generated in the brain. Consciousness at this point that we're talking about is higher than the brain. We call it our higher self or our soul. He says practicing the 8 limbs allows us to do that.
It's almost like where I would have more opportunities to find inspiration, more if I was an artist or if I was a musician, get more juice for to take these creative next steps.
Anytime writing occurs or music is played at in a passionate way, when you get lost in your craft, that's a meditation. That's nearing this realm that we're talking about. And then the next sutra, he enumerates the 8 limbs. So all 8 of them, which we said, he calls the yamas restraints, the niyamas observances. So there are 5 of each, like we said. And then physical posture, which is asana, mastery of the pranic force, which is the breath work. Then recalling the senses, he calls that pratyahara. Then the last 3, which are the meditative ones, concentration, flat out concentration, meditation, which is dhyana, and then he calls samadhi spiritual absorption in this book, are the 8 components of yoga. And then the next 15 sutras or so, he explains each one.
One of the things as we're going over this and even how you mentioned Eckhart Tolle can just almost make it a more resonant way of interpreting aspects of the 8 limbs. So can aspects of religion itself, like whether you're a Buddhist, Muslim, or Christian or Catholic, all those things can encompass aspects of the yamas and niyamas. But then the thing that I think the 8 limbs does that sometimes other religions don't necessarily emphasize is the physical body, that's where the asanas do matter. Right. That's where optimizing and taking care of our vessel, which is this vehicle for us to have these experiences.
It's super important. Our physical health is very important. I haven't looked at the actual 10 commandments in a long time, but let's see if there's one that does relate to physical health. I actually printed them. Let's check it out. You shall have no other gods before me. Okay, that has nothing to do with the body, right? You shall not make idols. You shall not take the name of the Lord God in vain. Okay, so far there's nothing about the body. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Honor your father and your mother. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. Those are yamas right there. Those are literal. And then number 9, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. And then number 10, you shall not covet. That's a yama as well. Nothing about health. Physical health.
And this is where it's almost, it's not to say one's better or worse, but it's just the idea of they're all, it's like music itself. There's many ways to communicate sound and feelings and emotions and provoke insight. And again, I think a big thing I want to make sure I'm not doing is trying to say yoga is better than Christianity or anything like that, or anything that's better than anything. It's just more of recognizing the interconnectedness of a lot of philosophy or a lot of religion and yoga itself.
There is a connection through all of them, in my opinion. Let's check out the Noble Eightfold Path in Buddhism. Now, this is not from Patanjali. This is from the Buddha, who is, by most accounts, alive on Earth 300 years before Patanjali. Here are the 8 guidelines or suggestions in Buddhism. right mindfulness, right effort, right livelihood, right action, right speech, right resolve, right view, and right concentration. So livelihood, effort, action, those probably relate to the body. I'm not a scholar of Buddhism, so I don't know what they entail, but those certainly appear to relate to how we personally do our own life and what we eat, how we treat others and such. Let's look at the 5 yamas and niyamas.
We live in this abundance of information, abundance of wisdom, abundance of philosophy. We can I can read all these things and think about them and ponder about them, but just I think the selling point that I always kind of try to get to with knowing any of this is like, how does this improve my life?
Yeah.
I guess going to your life, when you found out that these even exist, did you think about it as, okay, I need to start working towards implementing these in my life and taking an inventory on my day-to-day on how these things are, how I'm doing with these?
Yes. I didn't feel like I wasn't doing them already, though. It helped me reframe what I thought these words meant. We have one yama that's truthfulness, satya, and most of us don't really ponder what the implications of that are. But we did in our training last week. We talked a lot about truth and what there's so many variants of truth. Or are there? Or is it black and white? Is there just flat out truth? And so I was able to then contemplate each one and analyze, what is my true motivation for doing certain things in life? What is my view on the world? What are my actual goals? How do I really treat people and myself? It helped me ponder my own existence more. And I realized I was, like I said, I was doing most of them already, but without really knowing what I was doing. And now I had a framework for it.
Yeah. But even all those questions, those are creating opportunities for self-inquiry.
Exactly. And that's what I would hope everyone does. The self-inquiry is this foundation for making change and benefiting your life. So if you read that we should not waste our sexual energy, brahmacharya, when some people read that, the translator might say no sex. And you might think, how do you have a baby? Well, exactly. Certain dharmas, certain life purposes do require us to be parents. You got to probably usually have sex for that. But how about how much sex, and how much do you think about it when you're not having it, and how much time and effort do you waste on it when it's not necessary and such? Those are the things that each of us, no one else, but each of us should ponder for ourselves. That's the juice of this. And if you don't want to ponder it, don't. Don't worry about it. Focus on something else if that's not important to you now. That's why this is not doctrine.
Yeah, and if anything, it goes back to a recipe where it's, let me see what happens if I try this and see how it affects my life.
Exactly, and I would hope that people do. I guess I should finish that thought, though. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. But then also, don't get too mad when stuff goes wrong and you can't have an answer for it, or you're always tired and you don't realize, maybe I'm wasting my energy. Maybe I'm looking at too much whatever. Yeah. Maybe I'm focusing my mind on things that aren't healthy. Watching too much, like I think I said last time, Game of Thrones, I use that one a lot. When you question why life seems hard or unfair in certain ways, how diligent are we with our yamas and niyamas?
Yeah. And with that being said, it's going to be a whole other episode where we actually break them down more, but I mean, you want to share some of them?
Yeah. Yamas.
Or share them?
Please. I would love to. The 5 yamas relate to ethics, and those are nonviolence, which we call ahimsa. So don't harm other living things. Don't harm yourself. Does that mean you can't cut a plant down to eat it? Of course it doesn't mean that. We got to eat. Does it mean you can't kill an animal to eat it? That's up for interpretation, the concept of vegetarianism and veganism. But that all relates to ahimsa, nonviolent. Then satya, which is truthfulness. We talked about that a little bit. Non-stealing, which is asteya, sounding kind of like the 10 Commandments a little bit. Continence, or brahmacharya, we have that one. Non-possessiveness. You mentioned something similar, contentment. Non-possessiveness, aparigraha. All right, so those relate to morals. And then, non-possessiveness, meaning don't grasp too hard. Some of us are, and there's a pop culture phrase for it. Most of our listeners have probably heard it. Scarcity mindset. That's a pop culture cliche. That's what Patañjali is talking about regarding non-possessiveness. Now, of course, you might hold a title, a deed to your car and a deed to your real estate, and you might have clothing that you own, of course. And when things shift and change and move, and how much do we fight to hold on to what we Do we want more? Are we okay with letting things go when it comes time for a change? Of course, with fairness. Of course, there are laws. I mean, it's about being aware and just how much are we grasping. That's that. So those are the yamas. I will guarantee that if the more we practice these things, the less suffering we'll have. We talked about a lot about truth and why lying creates suffering for us. The liar, even if it's white lies that don't hurt anybody, that's what makes them white. They're not that bad, right? But we talked about why those can create suffering for us. And if we believe we're good people and yet we still can't figure out why life seems hard and we suffer sometimes, how many white or gray lies are we telling? Just ask yourself that. And then the niyamas relate more to your disciplines. The first one is saucha, or purity. Purity relates to, of course, the food we eat, but also what digital content do we consume all the time? What do we do in our spare time? What do we do when no one's watching us? When we think no one's listening to us, what do we do? How pure is our intake of anything? And then we have santosha, which translates literally to contentment. Are we always wanting more? Or are we okay with not getting the next model of whatever item comes out? I can be bad about that. I don't do a lot of contentment sometimes. Study. Svadhyaya relates to studying ourself and studying wise teachers' offerings. Trustful surrender to Ishvara. This is the one that you and I both like a lot. Ishvara is a word that's given as a replacement for the word God. The word God is convoluted with images of a man up in the air somewhere who judges us and who can either accept us into heaven or not. And so this word Ishvara relates to, I'm going to say again what I said earlier about what God might be. Everything in the cosmos, everything, and the interconnectedness between everything that we can't see, Ishvara. So when we trustfully surrender to, that's exactly what Eckhart Tolle is saying. We're living in God. Exactly the same thing. You're living as if you are part of this being, this greater life form.
Yeah, and I think even as you were reading those, they sound, like they sound like the commandments, but the thing that I feel like is different for me at this season of my life is just finding how to integrate these in my work.
Yes.
Which is that, okay, I don't need anything to be different than anything what it is, like finding contentment, and then realizing the interconnectedness one is really important to me because it's this idea of this reminder that I don't have to have everything be this spectacular life event moment that I'm changing for someone and that they're changing for me. It's a small handful of actions and realizing that everything matters and at the same time it doesn't, in terms of the weight of pressure that anything needs to be an outcome based off of what I think it is. So meaning that nothing, like the outcomes don't matter, but then realizing that the process of just connecting with people with who I am and engaged in that moment is essentially what brings opportunities for fulfillment. So it's all those small, especially with the patients that I see that I don't want to see, where I'm like, oh, there's something that I learned from this moment, either even about myself in that, oh, I'm just projecting, or that realizing their own humanity and seeing that, oh, we have so much more alike than not. Because that's what I think a lot of the 8 limbs are just essentially doing, is just this idea of self-inquiry and the awareness, yes, and then taking this inventory and becoming more okay with myself, and which will allow me to have less judgment and more compassion for other people.
That may be one of the biggest things of this whole thing, is being okay with ourselves. That was, to me, that was the theme of what you just said. You started that share by saying not every single moment has to be some big profound thing. I think the same way, and I call that the imposter syndrome that creeps in. I don't know if that's how you relate to it, but sometimes I feel like, oh, this situation that I'm kind of in charge of is not as profound as I want it to be. I want this to be better for them. I want them to think this is, no. Is that kind of what you were describing?
Yeah, it's just this idea of, it's essentially ego. It's an exercise of my own ego.
We're on the same page. Okay, good. And then the idea of connectedness. Treat others how you'd want to be treated. If you do believe we're all part of the same organism somehow, I know science doesn't say that yet, but if you hurt someone else, it's like you're cutting, you're creating a wound on your skin, you're scratching it, or you're doing something to yourself. You mentioned, I loved our conversation at our last teacher training session together where we were talking about honesty. You said that in your business, you tell the truth because it's always, not that you wouldn't tell the truth, but you don't sugarcoat the truth, rather. You tell them in a kind way what's going on, because how are they going to fix their health if they don't know? If you're saving their feelings, that's not cool.
Yeah, and it's
That's
essentially I'm
lying.
just saving myself from the hard conversations, which is a reflection of
The doctor, man.
yeah, which is a reflection of sometimes of what would happen if I'm not facing my own questions within myself. Like how am I questioning myself? How am I talking to myself? But this is where again, I think that this is about a jumping off point for where we are in terms of the 8 limbs.
For sure.
And I really appreciate you taking the time to very briefly consolidate so much density.
It's not easy to teach the sutras in a short time. That's why it's not that exciting to look at these things, but it is, though, in a way, because if you do want to change your life, if you're ready for that, if you're ready to, this gives you a lot of great clues. Work on them all. Like, how do you work on transcending? How do you do that? Well, maybe do a yoga nidra, and when you're in the yoga nidra, intend to transcend. Have in your heart that you're going to expand your consciousness. That's a way to work on, and also work on being, a good person at the same time. When you
If you were a viewer and you were like, okay, I want to learn more about the 8 limbs, should I just Google 8 limbs and then just read what Wikipedia says, or
No.
do you have a
No, there are so many books on the Yoga Sutras, and the 8 limbs is actually the formal name for it is Ashtanga Yoga, not to be confused with the brand of Ashtanga that Patabi Joyce created as a vinyasa practice. Ashtanga Yoga relates to 8 limbs. Ashto, 8, anga, limbs, 8 limbs. That's what Ashtanga means. I have a few books that I can recommend. The one that I've been showing, if you were to go to a website, I would go to the HimalayanInstitute.com or yogainternational.com, because this guy, Pandit Rajmani Tiganayat, runs those websites. And I believe his books on the Yoga Sutras and the 8 limbs are some of the most understandable. The first chapter, The Secret of the Yoga Sutra. Then for a more complicated explanation that I think might even go deeper in certain ways, is called The Science of Yoga by I.K. Taimni. This is also a commentary on the Yoga Sutras. There are hundreds of Yoga Sutras books, and they all have the 8 limbs in them.
Yeah, man. I would love to, in future episodes, just even dive deeper in terms of the yamas and how to apply them in modern society, and examples of even people that are doing these things, just so that it can be digested and applied in everyday life.
Why don't we, maybe the next episode can be just yamas and niyamas.
Boom. Cool. Thanks, Paul.
My man, this was awesome.
Thanks, Charles.
Thanks,
You're
Charles.
the fucking man, dude.
The man.
I fucking love you,
The
Charles.
man.